Picture this. The White House is celebrating a major victory, announcing that Trump's tariff strategy just cut the U.S. trade deficit to a 5-year low, with November's gap more than halved compared to a year ago, largely thanks to tariff revenues flooding into the Treasury. Trump is vindicated, the economic nationalists are celebrating, and the administration is saying, "See, tariffs work." "We told you protectionism isn't the disaster," the economists claimed. And then at the exact same moment, two existential threats to the entire tariff regime emerge simultaneously. First, U.S. lawmakers just introduced a resolution to end Trump's 50% reciprocal tariffs on India, calling them illegal and harmful to American workers. Not just criticizing them, not just questioning them, but formally moving to terminate them through congressional action. And second, the Supreme Court is literally days or weeks away from ruling on whether half of Trump's emergency tariff authority is unconstitutional, a decision that could erase much of his tariff weapon overnight. So what we're watching right now is a collision between three competing realities. Economic data showing tariffs are working, at least by one important metric. Political revolt from lawmakers in Trump's own party, saying the tariffs are illegal and damaging, and constitutional review from the Supreme Court that could declare the entire framework unlawful, regardless of whether it is economically effective. And understanding how these three threads connect, why they're all happening now, and what it means for American trade policy going forward. That is what we need to unpack today, because here is what makes this moment so fascinating from a systems perspective. Most policy debates are either about effectiveness or legality. Does the policy work? Is it constitutional? But rarely do you have a situation where effectiveness and legality are in direct tension, where something might be working economically but failing legally, where success in one dimension creates crisis in another. And that is exactly what is happening with Trump's tariffs. The trade deficit numbers are genuinely impressive. Cutting it to a 5-year low isn't trivial. Trade deficits have been a persistent feature of the American economy for decades. The idea that you could significantly reduce them in the span of one presidential term through tariff policy contradicts what most mainstream economists said was possible. They argued tariffs would just raise prices for consumers, provoke retaliation from trading partners, and ultimately not change the fundamental drivers of trade imbalances. And yet here we are with data showing the deficit down substantially. Tariff revenues are up, imports are being discouraged. Domestic production in some sectors is increasing. By the metrics Trump set for himself, the policy is working, but effectiveness doesn't equal legality, and that is the tension at the heart of everything happening right now. Congress is saying even if tariffs reduce the deficit, the president doesn't have the constitutional authority to impose them unilaterally through emergency declarations. The Supreme Court is being asked to decide whether national security justifications for tariffs are legitimate or just pretextual excuses to bypass congressional authority over trade. And India, one of America's most important strategic partners, is caught in the crossfire of a tariff regime that might not survive legal scrutiny. So today I want to walk you through what is actually happening with these India tariffs, why Congress is revolting against them, what the Supreme Court case could mean for the entire tariff architecture, whether the trade deficit success is real or statistical illusion, and ultimately what this tells us about the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches in setting economic policy. Because by the end you are going to understand this isn't really about tariffs or trade deficits or India specifically. It is about whether we're a constitutional republic where laws constrain executive power, or whether presidents can declare emergencies to justify policies that Congress never authorized. And the answer to that question matters way more than any particular tariff rate. Let's start with the India tariffs themselves, because understanding what Trump actually did is crucial to understanding why it is so controversial. In early 2025, Trump imposed what he called reciprocal tariffs on India at a rate of 50%. The logic behind reciprocal tariffs is straightforward. India charges high tariffs on American goods entering their market, sometimes 20, 30, 40% on certain products. Trump's argument is if they charge us 40%, we should charge them 40%, hence reciprocal. The goal is either to pressure India into lowering their tariffs through negotiation, or to level the playing field by making Indian goods face the same barriers American goods face in India. On paper that sounds fair. Why should American companies face high tariffs selling to India, while Indian companies face low tariffs selling to America? That asymmetry disadvantages American producers and contributes to trade deficits. The reciprocal framework is meant to eliminate that asymmetry. But here is where it gets complicated both practically and legally. Practically, India's high tariffs exist for reasons that go beyond simple protectionism. India is a developing economy that uses tariffs to protect nascent industries, to generate government revenue, because their tax collection infrastructure is less developed than ours, and to manage their own trade balance. When you impose reciprocal tariffs on a country like India, you are not just responding to their trade policy, you are affecting their entire development strategy, and that has consequences. Since Trump imposed the 50% tariffs, trade tensions between the US and India have escalated significantly. India has threatened retaliatory tariffs on American goods. They've slowed approvals for us, companies operating in India. They've signaled they might pivot toward closer economic relationships with China or the EU. This matters enormously because India is one of America's most important strategic partners in the Indo-Pacific. We need India as a counterweight to China, as a major defense partner, as an ally in critical technology sectors. Damaging the relationship over trade disputes is strategically short-sighted, according to critics. Now, Trump's defenders would say, you can't let strategic partnerships excuse unfair trade practices. If India wants American support against China, they need to open their markets to American goods. Fair point. But the question is whether tariffs are the right tool, or whether they create more problems than they solve. And that brings us to the legal dimension, which is even more contentious. Trump imposed these tariffs using emergency powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and national security provisions in trade law. Essentially, he declared that trade imbalances constitute a national emergency that threatens American security, and therefore he has authority to impose tariffs without congressional approval. That is a sweeping interpretation of presidential power. Congress has authority over interstate and foreign commerce under the Constitution. Trade policy has traditionally required congressional authorization through legislation. What Trump is doing is claiming that emergency powers and national security exceptions give him unilateral authority to reshape trade relationships without Congress. And here is where the Congressional Revolt comes in. Lawmakers from both parties are now saying this has gone too far. A bipartisan group just introduced a resolution to terminate the India tariffs specifically, calling them illegal because they weren't authorized by Congress and harmful to American workers, because they're disrupting supply chains that American companies depend on. The resolution cites constitutional concerns about separation of powers, economic concerns about retaliation and higher input costs for American manufacturers, and strategic concerns about damaging relationships with a key ally. Now, this resolution probably won't pass. Trump's base supports tariffs. Republicans are reluctant to directly contradict him. And Democrats have their own complicated relationship with trade policy. But the fact that it was introduced at all tells you something important. It tells you that even within the political establishment that generally supports Trump, there is recognition that the tariff strategy has legal and practical problems that can't be ignored. And it tells you that if the Supreme Court rules against Trump on the broader tariff authority question, there will be political support for actually enforcing that ruling rather than finding ways around it, because that is what is really at stake here. Not whether the specific tariff on India stands or falls, but whether future presidents will have the same claimed authority to impose tariffs unilaterally by declaring emergencies. If Trump gets away with it, every president afterward will use the same playbook. Declare emergency, impose tariffs, bypass Congress. That fundamentally changes the balance of power in American governance. Now let's talk about the Supreme Court case, because this is where the constitutional rubber meets the road. The case before the court challenges the legal foundation of Trump's entire emergency tariff regime. At issue is whether the president can invoke national security or national emergency statutes to impose tariffs that Congress never authorized. The specific legal question is whether the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and similar statutes give the president such broad authority that he can essentially rewrite trade policy unilaterally, or whether those statutes were meant for genuine emergencies, like wars, terrorist attacks, or imminent threats to national security, not for addressing trade imbalances that have existed for decades. This isn't a new debate. Previous presidents have stretched emergency powers in various ways, but Trump has taken it further than anyone. He has used emergency declarations to impose tariffs on allies, to redirect military construction funding for border wall, to implement immigration restrictions. The pattern is clear. When Congress won't give him authority to do something, he declares an emergency and claims inherent power. The Supreme Court now has to decide whether that is constitutional. And the stakes could not be higher, because this isn't just about tariffs. This is about whether the separation of powers still means anything. If the court rules that Trump's tariff authority is unconstitutional, it would invalidate not just the India tariffs, but potentially much of his broader tariff regime. Steel and aluminum tariffs imposed under national security justifications. China tariffs imposed under emergency powers. All of it could be subject to challenge. The economic disruption would be substantial. Companies that adjusted supply chains based on tariff structures would have to readjust. Tariff revenues that the government has been collecting would need to be refunded or stopped. Trade negotiations based on tariff leverage would collapse. It would be economic chaos. But if the court rules that Trump's authority is constitutional, it would establish a precedent that presidents have nearly unlimited power to reshape trade policy through emergency declarations. Future presidents could impose tariffs on any country for any reason by simply claiming it is a national security issue or national emergency. Congress's constitutional authority over commerce would become largely meaningless, and that might be even more dangerous long-term than the short-term economic disruption of invalidating existing tariffs. Because once you establish that presidents can bypass Congress through emergency declarations, there is no limiting principle. Every controversial policy that can't get through Congress becomes an emergency. Healthcare, immigration, environmental regulation, labor law, all of it could be reshaped through executive fiat. Now here is what makes the timing so critical. The Supreme Court is expected to rule on this within weeks, possibly before the end of the current term. We're not talking about some distant theoretical decision. We're talking about a ruling that could drop any day now and fundamentally reshape American trade policy and executive power. And the court's composition makes the outcome genuinely uncertain. You have 6 conservative justices who generally support executive power and might be inclined to give Trump broad authority. But you also have justices who care deeply about originalism and separation of powers and might conclude that Congress's Commerce Clause authority can't be usurped through emergency declarations. This isn't a straightforward ideological split. It is a question about constitutional structure that could divide the conservative justices. My prediction, and I am making this purely as an analysis, not advocacy, is that the court will issue a split decision that invalidates some tariffs while upholding others, based on how directly they relate to genuine national security concerns. Steel and aluminum tariffs might survive if the court accepts that domestic steel production has legitimate national security implications. But reciprocal tariffs on India, tariffs on consumer goods from China, broad-based tariffs that are clearly about economic policy rather than security, those are much more vulnerable. That kind of nuanced ruling would preserve some executive flexibility while preventing the most extreme abuses. But it would also create enormous uncertainty, because every tariff would be subject to legal challenge over whether it meets the national security test. Now let's examine the trade deficit numbers that the White House is celebrating, because this is where we need to separate signal from noise. The administration is correct that the trade deficit has fallen to a 5-year low. November's gap was more than half of what it was a year earlier. Tariff revenues are up substantially. Those are facts. But what do they actually mean? Are tariffs the cause of the improvement, And is reducing the trade deficit even a good thing? Let's start with causation, because it is more complex than the headlines suggest. Trade deficits are influenced by many factors beyond tariffs. Exchange rates matter enormously. If the dollar strengthens, imports become cheaper and exports become more expensive, widening the deficit. If the dollar weakens, the reverse happens. We've seen significant dollar movement over the past year that affects trade flows. Economic growth rates matter. When the U.S. economy grows faster than trading partners, Americans buy more imports, while foreigners buy fewer American exports, widening the deficit. When U.S. growth slows or trading partners accelerate, the deficit narrows. Global supply chains matter. Companies that decided to diversify away from China because of tariffs didn't necessarily bring production back to America. Many moved to Vietnam, Mexico, other countries. The bilateral deficit with China might shrink while the overall deficit stays constant or even grows. Energy prices matter. The U.S. is now a major energy exporter. When oil and gas prices are high, American energy exports increase, and the trade deficit narrows even without any change in tariff policy. So when you see the trade deficit falling, you have to ask how much of that is tariffs versus how much is these other factors. And the honest answer is it is really hard to disentangle. Tariff revenues are up. That is direct evidence that tariffs are having some effect. But tariff revenues being up doesn't necessarily mean the overall deficit shrinks. It means government collects more money. The deficit improvement could be coming from other sources. Now let's talk about whether reducing the trade deficit is even desirable. This might sound counterintuitive, but trade deficits aren't inherently bad. A trade deficit means we're importing more than we're export, but that also means foreigners are investing more in America than Americans are investing abroad, which is the other side of the accounting identity. When we run a trade deficit, foreigners accumulate dollars, and those dollars get invested in US assets, Treasury bonds, real estate, stocks, companies. That capital inflow funds investment, keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be, and allows Americans to consume more than we produce. The trade deficit is matched by a capital surplus. So reducing the trade deficit means reducing foreign investment in America. That might increase domestic production in some sectors, but it also means less capital available for investment, potentially higher interest rates, and lower consumption. The question isn't whether trade deficits are good or bad in absolute terms. The question is, what is optimal? Some level of trade deficit is fine and potentially beneficial. Too large a deficit can create dependencies and structural problems. The right level is debatable. But the idea that trade deficits are always bad and should always be minimized, that is mercantilist, thinking from a bygone era that most modern economists reject. Trump's view is that trade deficits represent America losing, getting ripped off by other countries. That is emotionally appealing, but economically simplistic. Trade isn't a zero-sum game where one side wins and the other loses. It is a positive-sum activity where both sides benefit from comparative advantage and specialization. The deficit is just an accounting identity that reflects capital flows, savings rates, investment patterns, and consumption preferences. Manipulating the trade deficit through tariffs doesn't change the underlying economic fundamentals. It just distorts market signals and creates inefficiencies. Now, that doesn't mean tariffs are always wrong. There are legitimate reasons for strategic tariffs. Protecting critical industries that have national security importance. Responding to unfair trade practices like dumping or subsidies. Using tariffs as leverage in negotiations. But using tariffs to hit an arbitrary trade deficit target, that is bad economic policy, even if the numbers move in the direction you want, because you are optimizing for the wrong metric. So what happens next? And what does this all mean for the bigger picture of American trade policy and constitutional governance? In the immediate term, we're going to get a Supreme Court decision within weeks that will either uphold Trump's tariff authority or strike down substantial portions of it. If the court upholds his authority, expect Trump to double down. More reciprocal tariffs on more countries. Broader use of emergency powers for trade policy. A fundamental shift toward protectionism that could last beyond his presidency. If the court strikes down his authority, expect chaos. immediate legal challenges to existing tariffs, demands for refunds of collected tariff revenues, trade negotiations collapsing because the leverage disappears, and probably new congressional legislation to either grant tariff authority or explicitly prohibit it, forcing lawmakers to actually take responsibility for trade policy. In the medium term, regardless of how the court rules, we're going to see a rethinking of how America approaches trade. The bipartisan consensus that dominated from the 90s through the 2010s, the idea that free trade and globalization were unambiguously good, that is dead. Both parties now acknowledge trade needs to serve American workers and national interests, not just abstract efficiency. But how you operationalize that, whether through tariffs or through other policy tools, that is still being fought over. The India situation, specifically, is going to remain tense. If the 50% tariffs stay in place, India will retaliate, and the relationship will suffer. If they get withdrawn because of the Supreme Court ruling or congressional pressure, Trump looks weak on trade, and his base is disappointed. The only good outcome is if the tariffs prompt serious negotiations that lead to a trade deal where India genuinely opens markets and the U.S. withdraws tariffs. But that requires diplomatic sophistication and willingness to compromise that haven't been characteristic of this administration's approach. And in the long term, this episode is going to be studied as a case study in executive overreach and congressional abdication. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Trump is using emergency powers this way because Congress has spent decades delegating its authority to the executive branch. They passed broad statutes giving presidents emergency powers, then never updated them when those powers started being used for purposes far beyond the original intent. They avoided taking hard votes on trade policy because it is politically easier to let presidents take the blame. And now we have a situation where one person can reshape trade relationships with major economies through unilateral declarations, and the only check is hoping the Supreme Court steps in. That is not how a constitutional republic is supposed to function. So if you take one thing away from this entire situation, it should be this. The trade deficit numbers, the India tariff fight, the Congressional Revolt, the Supreme Court case, they're all symptoms of a deeper structural problem. We've lost the balance between branches of government. We've concentrated too much power in the presidency. We've allowed short-term political convenience to override long-term constitutional principles. And until we fix those underlying problems, we're going to keep having these crises where controversial policies get implemented through questionable legal authority, then challenged through legal and political processes, creating enormous uncertainty for businesses, workers, and trading partners. That is not effective governance. That is not stability. That is lurching from crisis to crisis because we refuse to address fundamental questions about how power should be allocated and exercised. The tariffs might reduce the trade deficit. The Supreme Court might uphold presidential authority. Congress might back down from challenging Trump. But none of that fixes the real problem, which is that we've built a system where too much depends on the discretion of one person, where constitutional constraints have been eroded, where democratic accountability has been bypassed. And until we fix that, the specific outcomes of this tariff fight matter less than the precedents being set and the institutions being weakened. So pay attention, not just to whether the India tariffs survive, but to what authority future presidents will claim based on how this gets resolved. Because that is what will shape American governance for decades to come.